Hey everyone, welcome to Brews. And in this video, I'm going to cover what makes my deck building process a little bit different from other deck builders, and hopefully you'll find some tips and tricks to improve your own deck building as well. So in general, this is my process. It's a 7-step process, starting with the initial brew, which I'll cover in the next slide, into online testing and taking notes, writing down the problems that I foresee, and then researching solutions to those problems and iterating. I tend to repeat steps 2 and 3 about 100 times. That's a lot of iterations, more than most actually. But it is what I consider to be a good solid number to producing what is a very well-oiled, tuned, synergistic deck that just feels great to play. The fifth step here is to submit for the Play EDH deck check. Now, I like to build decks for Play EDH's mid tier. Uh, for some people, that's what they consider high power or 75% decks. It's not competitive tier and it's not casual tier. It's in that sort of sweet spot in between. But one thing is that it's well known that we generally tend to be bad at evaluating our deck's power level. A lot of people will overrate the power level of their decks or underrate it. And so by having the deck check process, which is part of the reason why I play on Play EDH in the first place, um, that deck check process gets an additional set of eyes from people who are very experienced with the format as well as the intended power level. And so they can tell me whether I've overtuned the deck and I need to power it down, or I've undertuned the deck and I need to power it up. And so, that additional set of eyes is kind of like the confirmation. And sometimes, they require me to make some changes, in which case I'll iterate, test those changes until I feel good about them, and then resubmit and sort of repeat this step until I eventually pass the Play ADH deck check. And then only after all that is done do I actually assemble the deck and paper. For me, I like to have the deck list complete before I start buying cards. It's just more economical that way. Now, onto the initial brew. I'm not going to really cover step one very much. We all have our own reasons for why we pick a commander. So, whatever reason yours is, it's yours. But on to step two, picking 2 to 3 win conditions. This is the first step for building any deck. If you're building for a lower tier of power, then you can replace the win conditions part of this with goals. Maybe you're playing a deck that is uh, aiming for a more casual format, or more casual power level, and so you're not really trying to win, but you're trying to do something like make 20 Pegasus tokens or something like that. Regardless, if you want to pick 2 to 3 goals that your deck has. In the case of Play EDH mid, that's going to be winning the game because it's still a relatively high power, 75% power format. And so you want to pick some win conditions that make sense with the commander, and you want to utilize existing resources like EDH Rec to see what others have done, because they've already done a lot of the legwork for you in picking win cons that naturally flow with the commander. And then from there, after I have those win conditions, and specifically the win conditions and not some of the other things that they've chosen, um, then I can move on to step three. And this is where I start to build the initial shell. But before I can build the initial shell, it's important to determine where the deck strategy fits in regards to the overall format. And this is something that a lot of other deck builders don't really take into account. So this diagram here on the right is taken from Patrick Chapin's Next Level Deck Building and was originally intended for 1v1 formats. However, it still seems to apply pretty well for the commander format. We have decks that are fast, which are listed as aggressive at the top. We have decks that are slow, which are listed as reactive. And in terms of their strategy for how they plan to win, it's either going to be unfair, whether it's some sort of infinite combo or locking everyone else out of the game and then breaking parity, or fair, whether it's like swarming the board with creatures or just beating people down with combat damage. And so every deck is going to fit into either one of these quadrants, right? Like fast combo decks are going to be top left, like fast swarm decks are going to be top right. Um, Mid-range battle cruiser type strategies tend to be in the bottom right, and then control combo, mid-range combo, those sorts of strategies tend to be in the bottom left. And it's important to note where your strategy falls because each one of these quadrants has a speed. The fastest decks tend to be top left and then to top right, and then the slower decks tend to be top left to top, or not top left, bottom left to bottom right. And so when you determine the speed of your deck strategy, uh, and by extension, what quadrant it's in, then whether you need to run more stacks or protection. And that kind of goes on to step 4 when we're filling out the rest of the initial shell. So to reiterate, I take the win cons from existing decks from EDH Rec that have kind of done that legwork for me. But for the rest of the deck shell, I tend to build on my own because a lot of decks that I see on EDH Rec and by extension Moxfield and Tapped Out and whatever don't actually run a good remaining shell. A lot of them just don't run enough interaction or maybe not enough protection. They aren't built with the consideration of other decks in the format, but instead built more in a vacuum. And so a lot of these lists where you see that they have more than 2 to 3 win cons because they packed every single win con that they could fit into the deck, that means they're lacking in something, whether that's interaction or stacks or protection. And so they're actually playing a much more solitary game. And they're likely to lose to other decks that can interact with them and then solidly protect their 2 to 3 win cons that they're designed to actually execute with precision and protection and consistency. Now, as to the rest of the shell, I just want to comment on a few things. Some of them are pretty standard: 8 to 10 ramp, 2 to 3 board wipes, 10 card draw. I don't know if that's actually standard. I know most people don't run enough card draw. Um, but one thing I want to mention is that the 8 to 12 interaction and stacks and protection, that might seem high to you. If it does, that's actually what you should be aiming for. In just because you don't want to be building your deck in a vacuum, and you won't be if you're considering the other decks in the format in this diagram on the right. And whether you add more stacks or protection is going to depend on what sort of strategy you have. So if you're a faster strategy, you don't want your faster strategy to get hosed by interaction, and so you need to run more protection pieces. If you're a slower strategy, you need to slow everyone else down so that your deck has the ability to play the game and really take its time to get there. Just because again, you're running a slower strategy, and so that means you need more stacks in your deck. That doesn't mean you run a pure stacks deck and try to lock everyone out, but just some stacks that allows you to slow down the game so that you can play. And then the last piece I want to talk about is the 34 to 35 lands. I think the reason why others don't actually run as much card draw, like the 10 card draw I've listed here, is because they're running more lands. And that's because the general sentiment at this time is that you should be hitting all of your land drops. And my argument against that is the same argument that competitive commander players have. And if you've never played competitive commander, I'll just lay it out for you because this is something that's actually really important to learn. Is that you don't need to actually hit every single land drop. Your deck operates on a certain ideal amount of mana, and that's what you need to hit. Whether your deck is it needs like 6 mana to function, that could be 4 lands and 2 mana ramp artifacts, or it could just be 6 lands, 7 lands. But the point is that there's going to come a point where you don't actually want to be drawing more lands, right? Like you want to be drawing gas, and the universal approach or what's more universally better is card draw. Because let's say you cut lands, and so you have to utilize the free mulligan and might even go down to 6. But if you have more card draw on the deck, and especially if 1/10 of your deck is card draw, then you're likely to draw into those lands that you need, even if you have to mulligan. But what you don't want to do is, you know, draw your opening hand, never have to mulligan like ever, but then start flooding out later on. Because that is what leads to games where you sit there and you take a turn that takes like 10 seconds. You drew your land, and you're like, dang it, draw another land, and then you play it. Oh, but I hit my land drop, but then I passed because I had nothing else to do. Card draw is universally better, and in almost every situation. And so if you want to hit that sweet spot of mana for your deck, as well as prevent yourself from flooding and to have more ways to draw gas when you want to draw gas, then find the sweet spot of lands that your deck actually wants to run, and then replace those slots where you're cutting land for more card draw. And so for me, that's generally been 34, 35. Some decks run less, some decks run more. But one thing I will not sacrifice is card draw because that is again more universally good. For testing online, I use Cockatrice. I like to use Power Level 8 as my room title because the joke, as we all know, is that every deck is a 7. And so by putting Power Level 7 as your room title, you get a bunch of decks that range in their actual power level. Power Level 8 kind of sits in that spot between 7, which again is a problematic number, and then 9 and 10, which most people consider to be competitive. Now some people consider Power Level 8 to be fringe competitive, but I have found that if we all have decently high power 75% decks, and someone joins with a fringe competitive deck, or if 2 people join with fringe competitive decks, we're still able to check each other. and it's still a pretty balanced pod. And so Power Level 8 has been um, the room title that's worked well for me on Cockatrice. Eventually, I may start building for some of Play EDH's other tiers, like their low power tier or their more competitive tier, in which case I'll have to use different room names. But for now, for Play EDH mid, which is what I build for, this title has worked for me. Now, when it comes to taking notes, there's one thing that I want to mention, and that is to make sure you're writing down the right problem. And the only way you know that you're writing down the right problem is by going back and reviewing the replay in which of the game in which you wrote down the problem. So, the reason why I say this is because let's say you have a game where you lose because an opponent swarmed the board with creatures really quickly, and then you died, and you wrote down the problem was you don't have enough board wipes, you don't have enough creature removal. And then you play another game, and then an opponent swarms the board really quickly with non-creatures, or they just, they play a lot of non-creatures very quickly. And so you write down, well, I need more non-creature removal. Now you're leading into the problem of you're stuffing your 99 cards with, or you're filling the 99 slots in your deck with um, a lot of these sort of removal interaction pieces, but now you're running the risk of not actually seeing the right ones. What happens if you draw all your creature removal and you're playing against a guy who's swarming the board with non-creature permanents? So then you wrote down the wrong problem, right? So what you should have done was review the replay and then try to identify how did that problem come to be in the first place. And you might notice that the only way they could come out of the gates swarming is probably because they ramped out mana really, really quickly. They established some sort of card draw engine, um, and there's various solutions to this. The first one I would say is, what is your deck strategy? Because if your deck strategy is really not that fast, if you're playing a slower deck strategy, then you need to run more stacks. You need to run things like rule of law effects, stuff that says players can't cast more one card a turn. Because if that's realistically what you're doing in the early game, you need to make sure everyone else is doing the same thing. Otherwise, you probably can't keep up. And so make sure to review your replays every time you write down a problem. Go back and review the replay. It doesn't have to be a slow review; it can be super fast, just to make sure that you wrote down the right problem, so that you don't spend time searching for solutions to solve the wrong problem. But as for the problems themselves, here's a list of common problems that I've identified, as well as common things to check for based on those problems. And the last thing I want to mention on this taking notes section is that it's important to write down the opening hand that you kept, because I've had a number of games, and I'll use my Sephiroth list as an example, where I didn't realize that a certain hand was not keepable, even though it would be keepable in a lot of other decks. So an example for Sephiroth is a turn 1 Sol Ring into Rhystic Study. That's considered by many people to be very keepable. However, we're playing in a high-powered format where people have interaction, and so they're likely to blow up your Rhystic Study really quickly. And what the Sephiroth list is actually trying to do is it's a reanimation deck. It wants to play a looter, something that says draw a card, then discard a card. It's trying to fill the graveyard quickly and dig through the deck. And that is actually more important to its early game plan than sticking a turn 2 Rhystic Study. Card draw is great, but you have to consider what is the deck actually trying to do in the early game. And you may not know. You build your initial brew, and you play and you keep a turn 1 Sol Ring into turn 2 Rhystic Study, and then you lose that game, and you're like, well, I kept what I thought was a keepable opening hand, but it turns out that the deck didn't really function very well afterward. And that's when you discover, okay, maybe the deck doesn't actually care about early card draw, but instead something else. Maybe it cares more about ramp. Maybe it cares more about putting a bunch of cards from the deck in the graveyard, self mill. And so once you determine what your strategy in your deck is actually wanting to do, that's when you can start to build this criteria for what is a keepable opening hand. But of course, if you're not logging your mulligans, then you're never going to know what is a keepable hand. You're not going to discover these insights. And so my last tip here on taking notes is that always write down the hand that you kept whenever you mulligan. And the last step here is researching solutions. Once you have your problems, it's important to figure out what sort of ways you're going to solve those problems. And sometimes it is not always stacks or more interaction. Again, this kind of goes back to the problem I mentioned earlier of writing down the wrong problem. If people are coming out of the gates swinging or really fast, and you take a little bit more time to ramp up, then adding more removal is not actually the problem, but rather you need to slow everyone else down. The inverse of that is also true here. If your deck has a faster strategy, but it seems like it's not running fast enough, or opponents are building up pretty quickly, even though your deck seems like it should be playing a fast strategy, then maybe the answer is not stacks and interaction, which, if you think about it, stacks and interaction slow you and other people down. But instead, if your deck is playing a fast strategy, you need to make your deck even faster. Just be careful of entering competitive territory if that's not really your goal. But again, that's kind of what play EDH deck checks kind of help eliminate, is they help make sure that you didn't overturn the deck. And then this is also where checking existing lists online on EDH Rec really helps. A lot of times in the initial brewing stage, I will look at a deck list. I will pick out the win cons, or I'll get an idea of the general win cons that the commander tends to roll with, or people who build that commander anyway. And then I'll see a bunch of cards that I don't really understand. And it's only through testing and iterating the list do I get an idea that, oh, this strategy with this commander, and this sort of style has these certain types of problems. And now I understand these cards that I'm seeing in other people's lists. They originally look like pet cards or kind of cute cards. That's when you start to realize, oh, they put these cards in there to solve very specific problems they found in testing. And so it's good to go back and review these lists later, after you've gotten some hands-on feel for your brew and testing your brew, because um, if you just copy all this stuff from the get-go, you don't really discover those insights necessarily. You might inadvertently get around those insights because you copied more than just the win cons from someone else's list. Um, and so you happen to have the answer in hand without realizing that a certain card was in there for a specific reason. And so later, when you make iterations, you might cut a card that was put in there for a specific reason that you don't really understand. I'm not sure if that what I said just made sense, but basically, you would rather have the process of going to these lists, finding those cards that you didn't really understand, and then understanding why they're there, rather than having them in the initial brew and then testing with your list and then being like, okay, well, I feel like some things need to change. And then you start cutting these cards that were in there from other people for very specific reasons that you didn't discover because they were originally in your list. Like, you didn't discover this deck or this strategy has those types of problems and that you need to keep those cards. Lastly, when it comes to specific card solutions, scryfall.com, using the advanced filters, is the best way to find a lot of cards that people have never heard of. A lot of my decks run cards that in play people have been like, I've never seen that card before. Wow, this is so good here. A lot of these unconventional cards are also very cheap to acquire, and the only way that you find them, especially if you've never heard about them, is by using scryfall.com. So that pretty much summarizes the 7-step process that I have. The process here is the one that I've used for all my existing decks, but this is the first time I've ever actually laid it out in paper and presented it to you guys. If you like what you've seen here, uh, I heavily encourage you to subscribe. This is the process that I take with all of my brews, and will be taking with all the deck lists that you see tested and tuned and developed here on this channel. And hopefully, going through this process has also given you some tips on how to improve your own deck building.